On November 12, 1844, exactly 1 week after, James Knox Polk emerged victorious in one of the most hotly contested presidential elections in U.S. history. 31 bodies were discovered floating face down in the cold, gray waters of the Susquehanna River near Pennsylvania's northern border. Each man bore the same haunting mark, a crude X carved into his left palm. Gripped tightly in every hand was a waterlogged ballot, all bearing the same candidate's name. Authorities quickly buried both the victims and the truth, declaring the tragedy a riverboat accident that, as later investigations would show, had never taken place. For nearly 180 years, the real story behind the so-called Millfield incident remained buried, deeper than those lost men, sealed away in courthouse. Records supposedly destroyed in a fire 3 decades later, but recently uncovered letters between a terrified county clerk and his brother exposed something far more sinister, a conspiracy that not only stained one small township's history, but also shook the very foundations of American democracy itself. Before diving into the blood-soaked mystery of Millfield's forgotten election, imagine the political fever gripping America in the autumn of 1844. The nation was divided in ways that feel eerily familiar today. The presidential race between Democrat James K. Polk and Whig candidate Henry Clay split families down the middle, turned neighbors into enemies, and transformed quiet towns into battlegrounds of ideology. Central Pennsylvania, a region defined by its coal-rich valleys and immigrant laborers, became a microcosm of the nation's larger conflicts. Debates over westward expansion, tariff policies, and the shadow of slavery spreading toward the western frontier. At the heart of this turmoil lay Millfield Township, a small settlement tucked beneath the Allegheny Mountains along the eastern bank of the Susquehanna. Home to roughly 400 residents, Millfield represented two Americas existing side by side. The township's eastern half was composed mostly of prosperous German and Irish farming families, people who had worked the fertile bottomlands for generations. They raised wheat and corn, tended livestock, and built steady livelihoods from the soil. Among their leaders were Heinrich Zimmerman and Cornelius O'Brien, respected landowners and devout believers in Henry Clay's American system. They supported high tariffs to protect domestic agriculture from foreign imports and favored federal investment in infrastructure, roads, canals, and rail lines that would connect their goods to distant markets. The western side of Millfield told a different story. There, recent immigrants from Wales and Scotland had built a rough mining settlement around the Blackstone mine. An anthracite operation opened only 2 years earlier. The mine was both dangerous and lucrative, drawing tough men and their families to carve out survival from rock and soot. Their informal leader was Gwilym Perry, a fiery Welsh miner whose loyalty to Polk's Democratic platform ran deep. Perry's men saw Polk's promises of territorial expansion and lower tariffs as their lifeline, policies that would reduce the cost of mining tools and equipment they desperately relied upon. Caught uneasily between these rival factions was Millfield's small merchant class, people like Samuel Hartwell, owner of the general store, Postmaster William Kensington, and Dr. Edmund Fairchild, the town's physician. They tried to maintain neutrality, but in Millfield, neutrality was becoming an unaffordable luxury. Even the landscape reflected the town's growing divide. A single narrow road wound through the valley, connecting the farming lands of the east with the mining settlement in the west. At its midpoint sat the township's small commercial district, Hartwell's store, Kensington's post office, Dr. Fairchild's modest practice, and the Millfield Inn, a weathered 2-story building that served as the unofficial hub for debate, gossip, and increasingly confrontation. Just south of this stood the limestone courthouse, a proud structure built in 1834 through community fundraising. By the fall of 1844, that courthouse had become the symbolic and literal center of Millfield's unrest. Local elections were set for November 5th, the same day as the national presidential vote. Offices that once changed hands through friendly agreement now sparked open hostility. The post of township supervisor, long held by Heinrich Zimmermann, was challenged by none other than Gwilym Perry. The tax collector's seat, previously occupied by William Kensington, drew a new contender, Owen Pritchard, Perry's brother-in-law. Most controversially, the role of Justice of the Peace, a position that allowed its holder to settle disputes, perform marriages and authorize arrests, had drawn 4 candidates, splitting loyalties even further. As election day approached, the tone in Millfield shifted from tense to dangerous. Farmers organized torchlight parades through the miners' quarter, their patriotic songs carrying undertones of threat to Welsh-speaking families. The miners, in turn, began gathering nightly outside Hartwell's store, grumbling about the farmers' wealth and their stranglehold on township politics. Even children stopped playing across factional lines. Wives avoided eye contact with neighbors whose husbands supported the opposing side. The tension finally erupted on November 3rd, just 2 days before the election. Overnight, vandals defaced the courthouse walls with crude political graffiti. In dripping red paint, one slogan above the entrance read, "Polk means poverty." Across the eastern wall, another message screamed, "Clay's cronies go home." When residents gathered the next morning to see the damage, angry shouts quickly escalated into shoving and near fighting. Only Dr. Fairchild's firm intervention and his threat to summon the county sheriff from 30 miles away prevented violence. That evening, as frost crept across the Susquehanna Valley, both factions held last-minute rallies. The farmers met in Zimmermann's large barn, where the seasoned landowner delivered a fiery defense of traditional values and local order. Meanwhile, Perry's miners gathered around a roaring bonfire near Blackstone Mine, listening as their leader spoke passionately about justice and opportunity for working men. From each camp, the other's fire was visible, a flickering reminder of the battle that would come with the dawn. Within 72 hours, 31 men from this community would be dead. The survivors would spend the rest of their lives haunted by the question of whether some truths are too dangerous to speak and too terrible to hide. The morning of November 5th, 1844, broke gray and bitterly cold across central Pennsylvania. A thin crust of frost coated the fields, and a sharp wind from the north carried the scent of snow. Despite the chill, people in Millfield rose early. This was not simply an election, it was Judgment Day. By sunrise, the courthouse doors stood open. According to Pennsylvania law, polling stations were to begin operation at dawn, and the town's election overseer, Judge Ezra Hawthorne, arrived promptly. A stern man in his 70s with a reputation for fairness, he had overseen township elections for nearly 20 years. What he saw chilled him more than the morning air. On the east side of the courthouse square stood Zimmermann and his supporters, farmers in heavy coats, speaking quietly in English and German. On the west side waited Perry's miners, faces streaked with coal dust, speaking in rapid Welsh that sounded to outsiders like the grinding of stone. The process itself began peacefully enough. Under state law, each voter wrote his candidate's name by hand and dropped the folded ballot into a locked wooden box supervised by 3 election judges. Judge Hawthorne, Merchant Samuel Hartwell, and, as a compromise meant to balance factions, Irish farmer Thomas Brennan, who lived near Millfield's southern edge. Throughout the morning, men approached in small groups, cast their votes and left. The tension was like steam in a sealed kettle, ready to blow but not yet erupting. Women and children, forbidden by law to vote, watched anxiously from doorways and windows. Even the dogs seemed uneasy, keeping close to their owners and avoiding the courthouse square. At noon, Hawthorne called for a short recess so the judges could take their meal. That fragile calm shattered moments later. From the direction of the Millfield Inn came shouting. Owen Pritchard, the miner running for tax collector, stumbled into the square, face bloodied and coat torn. 3 unfamiliar men followed close behind, rough-looking strangers in heavy boots and river-worn jackets, their walking sticks suspiciously resembling clubs. They tried to buy my vote. Pritchard gasped, pointing at the strangers. Offered me $50 to drop out of the race. When I refused, they said I'd regret it. Zimmerman stepped forward, his weathered face dark with anger. "Who are these men?" he demanded. "They've no business in our election." The largest of the strangers spat into the frost. "Name's Pike," he said, his accent marking him as a riverman from somewhere along the Ohio. "These are my partners, Crawford and Wade. We're here representing certain interests that want this election run fair and square." Judge Hawthorne drew himself up, voice cutting through the murmurs. "I don't care who you claim to represent," he said sternly. "This is a township election for township citizens. You'll leave immediately or face arrest for disturbing the peace." Pike laughed, the sound like gravel spilling from a bucket. "Arrest us? With what law? Your sheriff's 30 miles away, and word is he's got his hands full with election trouble of his own. We'll be staying till every ballot's counted. What happened next would be debated for generations." Some said Gwilym Perry crossed the square because he couldn't bear the insult to his people. Others believed he acted to protect his candidate from outside interference. Whatever the reason, he strode straight toward Pike. "You heard the judge," Perry said, his Welsh accent sharp with anger. "Leave us in peace." Pike studied him coolly, then smirked. "A Welsh miner, huh? Should have guessed. You people always stirring trouble where you don't belong." He pulled a folded paper from his coat. "Matter of fact, I've got a list right here of troublemakers who ought not be voting today. Your name's right at the top." From where they stood, townspeople could see that the list was long, 30 or 40 names, several already crossed out with thick black lines. Dr. Fairchild, standing on the courthouse steps, sensed disaster approaching. He recognized the physiological signs of violence brewing, rising heart rates, tense muscles, voices pitching toward shouts. He stepped between the groups, black medical bag in hand like a symbol of authority. "Gentlemen," he said steadily, "we're all neighbors here. We're all Americans. Whatever our differences, they should be settled through the process we came to uphold." Pike's reply was chilling. "Democracy's fine, Doctor, when it's limited to the right sort of people. But when foreigners and agitators think they can vote themselves into power." He let the sentence trail off. The implication was unmistakable. The words unleashed months of pent-up resentment. Farmers closed ranks around Pike and his men, while miners tightened formation around Perry. The line between law and chaos began to blur. Judge Hawthorne, desperate to maintain order, made a fateful decision. Instead of suspending the election, he insisted it continue, hoping that structure and procedure might calm tempers. "The election will proceed as scheduled," he declared. "All qualified voters will cast their ballots peacefully. Any who disrupt the process will be held accountable under Pennsylvania law." But by afternoon, it was clear that the law had lost its hold on Millfield. Pike's men stationed themselves by the courthouse doors, scrutinizing every miner who tried to vote. They whispered over their mysterious list, blocking some voters, waving others through. By 4 o'clock, as dusk crept into the valley, barely half the expected ballots had been cast. The miners were challenged, delayed, and humiliated, while farmers were encouraged and welcomed. Finally, with daylight fading, Gwilym Perry gathered his supporters, miners, laborers, and a few small farmers from the west, and led them in a tight column toward the courthouse. Their plan was simple: overwhelm the challengers by voting en masse, but that day in Millfield would not follow the rules of any ordinary election. As the group reached the courthouse steps, Pike raised his hand in a silent signal. What followed unfolded in seconds and would scar the town forever. Pike's voice cut through the crowd like a whip. "I'm placing these men under citizen's arrest," he shouted. "Conspiracy to commit election fraud!" Confusion erupted instantly. The miners pushed forward, demanding to know by what authority Pike claimed such power. Across the square, Zimmerman's supporters, mistaking the movement for an attack, surged toward the courthouse to block the entrance. In the chaos that followed, no one could later agree on who threw the first punch. Within seconds, Millfield's election day turned into a brawl. Neighbors who had farmed, worked, and worshipped together for years swung fists at one another, fueled by rage and fear. The air filled with the sounds of shouting in English, German, and Welsh, the universal language of violence. Women screamed from the edges of the square, clutching their children. Dr. Fairchild rushed into the melee, abandoning his black bag to pull men apart, pleading for sanity. Judge Hawthorne shouted for order from the courthouse steps, but his voice was swallowed by the uproar. For a few terrible moments it seemed the fight might burn itself out through exhaustion, but Pike hadn't come to Millfield unprepared. From the direction of the Susquehanna River came a piercing whistle. 3 sharp blasts. The noise froze the combatants in place. Bruised faces turned toward the riverbank just as dozens of flickering lanterns appeared, moving in formation toward the township. The crowd fell silent. Through the gathering dusk, dark figures approached, men moving with disciplined precision, their steps heavy, deliberate, purposeful. The glint of metal shone in the torchlight. These were no townsmen. They carried rifles. Pike wiped blood from his split lip and grinned. "Told you," he said. "We represent certain interests, and they don't take kindly to fraud." The crowd watched in growing terror as the newcomers entered the square. Their leader, a tall man with a military bearing and an unmarked gray coat, stepped forward. His voice was calm but commanding. "My name is Captain Thorne," he announced. "We have credible evidence of organized fraud, sedition, and attempts to undermine lawful government. By the authority vested in me by concerned patriots, this township is now under provisional supervision until order can be restored." The stunned townspeople stared, unable to comprehend what was happening. Zimmerman, blood still trickling from his nose, summoned what dignity he could. "By what authority do you claim this power?" he demanded. "This is Pennsylvania soil. We live under state and federal law, not the dictates of armed men." Captain Thorne smiled thinly. "The Constitution protects citizens, Mr. Zimmerman. It does not protect traitors. Our duty is to safeguard the Republic from subversion, no matter where it hides." At his signal, 2 of his men unrolled a large document. Even from a distance, its wax seals and ornate handwriting gave it an air of authenticity. "These affidavits," Thorne said, "come from reliable sources. Foreign agitators have infiltrated this community to corrupt your election." Judge Hawthorne stepped forward, noting immediately that the seals were irregular, the script inconsistent. "That's no legal warrant," he began, but stopped when Thorne's soldiers raised their rifles. The message was clear. Argument meant death. Dr. Fairchild tried once more to appeal to reason. "Captain Thorne, if you believe there's been wrongdoing, the proper course is to notify county authorities. They can investigate lawfully." Thorne's reply revealed the madness behind his authority. "Doctor, the corruption runs deeper than your county. State officials, even federal officers, they're compromised. We answer to no man but our conscience and our country." That declaration confirmed every citizen's worst fear. These were not lawmen, they were zealots. Gwillem Perry, refusing to be cowed, stepped forward despite the rifles aimed his way. "We're citizens," he said, voice trembling with anger but not fear. "We have every right to vote. If you have accusations, take them to court. Otherwise, you and your men should leave." Thorne's cold gaze shifted to Pike. "Read the charges," he ordered. Pike unfolded his list once more and spoke in a mock-official tone. Gwilym Perry, native of Wales, arrived 1841. Employed at Blackstone Mine. Accused of organizing foreign workers against American interests and promoting policies favorable to hostile powers. The miners murmured in disbelief. Perry's fists clenched. "That's a lie," he shouted. "I came here legally. I've worked, paid taxes, raised a family. My only crime is believing in fair wages and the right to vote." Thorne's reply cut deep. "Rights," he said, "are earned through loyalty, and they can be revoked just as easily." He gave another signal. Armed men began separating the crowd, farmers to the east side, miners and their sympathizers to the west. Any who resisted were struck with rifle butts and threats. By the time the process ended, 31 men stood apart from their families, encircled by Thorne's guards. Among them were Perry, Pritchard, and Brennan, the Irish election judge. Judge Hawthorne stepped forward once more, trembling with fury and age. "Captain Thorne, as an appointed officer of this township, I demand you release these men. Their detention is unlawful." Thorne turned to him with contempt. "Your authority, Judge, comes from a system that's already rotten. These men will remain in custody pending investigation, unless you'd like to join them." For the first time in his career, Ezra Hawthorne faltered. He looked at the frightened faces around him, the women clutching children, the soldiers' fingers tightening on triggers, and realized resistance would mean massacre. The sun vanished behind the Alleghenies. Torches flared to life around the square, casting long shadows across terrified faces. "Citizens of Millfield," Thorne declared, "we will now conduct a proper investigation. Those who cooperate will be treated fairly. Those who resist justice will face consequences." The investigation began immediately. The 31 detained men were surrounded by armed guards as their families screamed and pleaded. Samuel Hartwell, usually cautious and quiet, found his voice. "Captain, these men are no traitors. They voted their conscience. That's their right." Thorne turned toward him, his expression icy. "Voting is sacred, Mr. Hartwell, when done honestly. Fraud and conspiracy are not rights. They are crimes," Hartwell persisted. "Then show us your proof. What evidence do you have?" Pike held up more papers, covered with ornate handwriting and meaningless seals. "We have documentation of communications between these men and agents of foreign powers," he said. Grandly, Judge Hawthorne could see from his vantage point that the papers were held too far away for anyone to read. They were theater, nothing more. Dr. Fairchild stepped forward again, courage outweighing fear. "Even if your claims were true, Captain, these men are entitled to due process. Trial by jury, representation. You're violating every principle this country stands for." Thorne's calm reply chilled everyone within earshot. "The system you describe has failed, Doctor. Justice must be reclaimed by those still loyal to the nation's founding ideals. We're restoring order, real order." The implication was horrifying. These men believed themselves saviors, not murderers. By midnight, a light snow began to fall, its flakes turning orange in the torchlight. Thorne ordered his men to prepare the prisoners for transfer. They were to be taken, he said, to a secure location for questioning. That location was an abandoned ferry landing 3 miles downstream. It had once been a bustling river port, but was now little more than rotting wood and empty buildings, isolated, quiet, and perfectly suited for what Thorne intended. Ropes were produced. The prisoners' hands were bound. Guards formed ranks. As the march began, families surged forward in panic. Some pleaded, others prayed. Catherine Perry, Gwilym's wife, broke free from the crowd and ran to her husband. A guard shoved her back, but not before she managed to grasp his bound hands. "They can't do this," she sobbed. "You've done nothing wrong. Remember, truth will prevail. God sees everything." Her husband tried to answer, but the guards dragged him away. Her words would prove both a curse and a prophecy. The march to the river took nearly 2 hours. The bound men stumbled through frozen mud and uneven paths, while soldiers pushed them onward with rifle barrels. A few older prisoners, including Judge Brennan, struggled to keep up. Dr. Fairchild, permitted to accompany the group as a medical observer, noted every detail, the direction they took, the familiarity with which Thorne's men navigated the terrain. It was clear they had scouted the route long before Election Day. At last, the convoy reached the ferry crossing. Moonlight reflected off the river like silver fire. The old warehouse loomed near the water, its windows broken, roof sagging, and stone foundation blackened with age. Inside, the men discovered a grim preparation. Ropes hung from the beams. A ring of chairs waited near the center. Tables held knives, hammers, and iron tools that glinted ominously in the lantern light. Pike consulted his list one final time. "Gentlemen," he announced, "you've been identified as participants in a conspiracy against the Republic. We will now begin your interrogation." Perry raised his chin. "You call this justice?" Pike's lips twisted into something that might have been a smile. "Call it what you want, Mr. Perry. We call it patriotism." Captain Thorne stepped forward, his voice almost gentle. "Rights," he said, "exist only for those loyal to the nation. When men betray that loyalty, they forfeit those rights." The horror in his logic was as complete as it was cold. Dr. Fairchild's instinct as a physician compelled him to intervene. "Even if they were guilty," he said, "they're still American citizens. They're entitled to a trial. What you're doing violates every principle of our laws." Thorne looked at him with the detached calm of a man who had already crossed every moral line. "Law, doctor, is a tool of the corrupt. We are the cure." And with that, the interrogations began. The screams that filled the warehouse that night would haunt the Susquehanna Valley for generations. Thorne's men took the prisoners one by one, questioning them about voting, political meetings, and supposed connections to foreign agents. Each session ended the same way, with blood, broken silence, and the echo of boots across the floorboards. Dr. Fairchild, forced to treat wounds he could not prevent, realized the pattern. These interrogations weren't meant to uncover truth. They were meant to extract confessions that justified murder. The men knew things about each prisoner that only someone from Millfield could have told them. Who they met with, what they said, where they worshipped. The implication was unmistakable. Someone from the township had betrayed them. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the valley in a deceptive calm, while inside the warehouse, democracy itself was being strangled. By dawn on November 6th, all 31 prisoners had been questioned. Some had broken under torture, signing false confessions. Others had maintained their innocence in silence. Perry was among the latter. Thorne gathered his men. "We've learned all we need," he said. "Prepare the final operation." Dr. Fairchild, overhearing, understood immediately what final meant. He tried to intervene, but Pike shoved him aside. At sunset, Thorne stood before the bound prisoners and read a single sentence from one of his counterfeit documents. By order of loyal American citizens, these men are found guilty of sedition, conspiracy, and treason. Sentence death. A hush fell. Perry lifted his head. "Captain Thorne," he said hoarsely, "history will remember this night. You may drown us, but you can't drown the truth." Thorne's expression didn't change. "History," he said coldly, "is written by the survivors." Outside, the Susquehanna flowed dark and merciless under the November moon. The warehouse at the old ferry crossing had become a chamber of dread. The lanterns burned low, their light flickering across faces drawn tight with pain and disbelief. The 31 prisoners sat in silence, bound by rope and fear, the air thick with the smell of damp timber and iron. Outside, the wind moved across the river in long, mournful sighs, carrying the faint creak of boats shifting against the dock. Captain Thorne moved among the men with the confidence of someone who had convinced himself that cruelty was virtue. To him, this was not murder but purification, a necessary cleansing of a corrupt republic. Every movement was methodical, rehearsed, precise. His followers mirrored that precision, eyes hollow, jaws clenched, their loyalty numbed by the conviction that they were saving their nation from unseen enemies. Dr. Fairchild's hands trembled as he wrapped torn cloth around wounds he had been ordered to treat. His medical instincts rebelled against what he witnessed, but he knew resistance meant death, not only for himself, but for anyone he might try to protect. The night stretched on, a ceaseless rhythm of questioning, shouting, and muffled cries that faded one by one until the warehouse echoed with only the sound of wind against the walls. When morning came, the light that filtered through the shattered windows revealed what the night had hidden. Blood darkened the wood beneath the prisoners' feet. The men sat in exhausted silence, eyes fixed on the floor or the faint strip of daylight crawling across the wall. The interrogations had not been meant to uncover truth. They had been theater, a performance staged to justify what had already been decided. Thorne's men moved with renewed energy, preparing for what came next. Outside, boats were dragged closer to the dock. Coils of rope were checked and tightened. From the hill above, the faint chiming of Millfield's courthouse clock carried faintly through the cold air, marking the passage of time for a town that had no idea how much it was losing. Dr. Fairchild found a moment when the guard's attention drifted. From his coat pocket, he drew a small scrap of paper and began to write, his hand shaking. He recorded the names he could still remember, the accusations, the faces of the men who called themselves patriots. He tucked the note between two loose stones in the wall near the warehouse floor, a desperate message to whoever might find it. It was a fragile hope, but it was all that remained. As the day faded, the preparations became impossible to ignore. The guards' voices grew quieter, movement sharper, the rhythm of a group that had accepted the task before them. Some of them showed signs of unease, a tremor in the hand, a glance that lingered too long on the bound men, but none stepped out of line. Fear of their captain, or perhaps of themselves, kept them in motion. By nightfall, the prisoners were gathered into small groups. The air outside had turned bitter. Snow drifted from the dark sky and settled on the river like ash. The torches along the dock hissed in the wind, their light reflecting off the black water. Thorne stood at the edge of the wharf, staring into the current, his thoughts known only to himself. When he turned, his expression was calm, almost serene. Each prisoner was weighed down with stones bound to their ankles, the knots tied with brutal efficiency. There were no formal announcements, no final statements read aloud. Only the steady sound of boots against the planks, the scraping of ropes, the shuffling of bound feet. For some, faith filled the silence. Others stared blankly ahead, beyond fear, beyond hope. The first boat slid from the dock, carrying 4 men and 3 guards. The oars creaked softly, vanishing into the fog that hovered above the water. Moments later, the faint splash of weight-meeting current broke the night, followed by nothing at all. The boat returned empty, and another took its place. Thomas Brennan was among the next to leave. The Irish farmer had been an election judge that morning, believing his service an act of civic duty. Now he was a condemned man in the same township he had sworn to serve. When the guards led him forward, his lips moved silently, not in protest, but in prayer. The boat carrying him disappeared into the same mist that had swallowed the first. Each trip followed the same grim ritual. 4 men led down to the boats. A brief struggle, the sound of water closing over them, and then silence. The rhythm of it was mechanical, efficient, the kind of order that can only exist when conscience has been fully silenced. The river became a dark ledger, recording the disappearance of a community's sons, husbands, fathers. Inside the warehouse, the remaining prisoners listened to the distant splashes, each one marking another soul gone to the depths. The smell of the river drifted in through the cracks in the walls, mixing with sweat and the faint tang of blood. The waiting was almost worse than the dying. They could see in the eyes of the guards that there would be no reprieve. Dr. Fairchild's turn came near the end. The guards hesitated when they reached him. Even in the twisted logic of Thorne's world, there was discomfort in killing a physician. But hesitation was a weakness Thorne did not tolerate. A sharp order cut through the night, and the men obeyed. As they forced him toward the dock, Fairchild managed one final act of defiance. He pressed his coat against the dock's foundation, wedging the hidden note deeper between the stones. The cold air stung his face. He could smell the river iron salt decay. The current whispered below like something alive, patient and hungry. The guards rowed in silence. The river stretched endlessly ahead, its surface broken only by the occasional ripple where stones sank beneath. One of the guards avoided Fairchild's gaze, his hands trembling on the oars. The others stared straight ahead, their faces hard but pale. Fairchild looked once toward the stars, their reflections scattered across the water, and then there was only the sound of the river closing over him. By 3 in the morning the work was done. The last boat returned empty, its oars cutting softly through the dark water. Thorne stood at the edge of the dock, watching as the current carried away any trace of what had been done. The torches were extinguished one by one until only the cold light of the moon remained. When his men were finished, he ordered them to burn what they could not carry: the ropes, the lists, the blood-stained rags, and by dawn, the warehouse stood empty except for the lingering scent of smoke and death. Back in Millfield, families kept their lamps burning through the night, waiting for men who would never come home. The town was silent, except for the wind moaning through bare branches and the distant barking of dogs. None dared to speak of what they feared. The election had ended, but something far larger had been lost. Morning came with an unnatural stillness. The sky hung low and grey over the valley. Down by the ferry crossing, Thorne's men were already gone, their tracks half erased by fresh snow. Only a few signs of their presence remained: boot prints in the mud, fragments of rope, and the faint smell of burnt wood where torches had been doused. It might have ended there, with 31 names quietly erased from history, if not for a single act of chance. During the night, Dr. Fairchild's horse had broken free from where it had been tied near the warehouse and wandered back toward town. When the animal appeared in the square at dawn, its saddle empty, its reins dragging through the frost, the women who had been waiting knew something had gone terribly wrong. Catherine Perry was the first to move. Wrapped in her husband's coat, she gathered others, wives, sisters, and a few men who had escaped suspicion. Hinrich Zimmermann joined them, the old divisions between farmer and miner forgotten in the face of grief. Together they followed the horse's trail through the snow toward the river. The road was quiet, the landscape eerily peaceful after the night's horror. When they reached the ferry crossing, the truth revealed itself in the silence. The warehouse stood open, its door hanging crooked. Inside, the floor was stained dark. Ropes dangled from the beams, and the air carried the unmistakable smell of blood and smoke. A chair lay overturned beside a table strewn with tools no longer used for work, but for torment. Zimmermann's practiced eye caught the details the others missed. Footprints, dozens of them, led from the warehouse to the dock. The planks were scarred with drag marks where heavy weights had been pulled toward the boats. Near the water, the snow was disturbed, mixed with streaks of something darker that had frozen overnight. He followed the trail until he saw fragments of rope and a single boot print, half filled with icy water. There was no need for discussion. The river had taken them. Catherine knelt near the dock, her hand resting on a patch of blood-stained snow. She whispered her husband's name as if saying it could bring him back. Around her, the others searched through the debris in silence until one of the women found a small piece of folded paper wedged between two stones. The ink was smudged, but the handwriting was clear. It was Dr. Fairchild's note. The message confirmed their worst fears. Names, dates, accusations, all laid out in precise, deliberate script. The note spoke of organized murder, of lists compiled by someone within the township, and of a group calling itself the American Patriots Alliance. The discovery turned grief into terror. If the killers had informants in Millfield, no one could be trusted.